It's really a pleasure to be here. Merit and you and the Maastricht academic community has always been very close to me because of Luxuta, because of Chris Freeman, because of myself coming here 3 or 4 times. The Evolutionary Economics book was written with the last meeting in Maastricht. So I have very fond memories, and I also know that you people do very good work. So I hope I can contribute to some of your thinking, and I am sure I will learn a lot from your questions and comments. But I have to warn you that last night we had a very interesting dinner with a few of your colleagues, and I asked them to help me what to cut. And they didn't want anything cut. So instead of cutting sections, I had to cut the amount of slides for each section. So I say less of each one rather than saying a lot of a few. And that means that I chose something else which we also agreed, which is that if you want to know more about any of the sections, you're going to have a long presentation with lots of slides that explain everything. So you will have the possibility of seeing some more, and if you want, you can write an email. As long as it's a short question, I promise I will answer immediately. If it's a long question, I put it on my pending list, and you might get a reply within 2 or 3 weeks. So you choose, but you're welcome. You're very welcome. And I guess that's all I have to warn you about. And let's start. So the discussion is about the new context for development around natural resources. So I'm assuming that you all know that there are lots of people who think natural resources are hopeless for development. So I'm going to explain why I think there are an opportunity for Latin America and other resource-rich countries, perhaps. This is the question, and here is my answer. Okay, all of you, I guess, know and agree, and most economists agree, that technology and innovation are the driving forces of growth and development. But the thing is that to take advantage of them, you can't just say innovation, development in the air, just any innovation and any technology. But we have to know and understand how they change, the changing nature of technology and innovation. We have to be aware of discontinuities, because opportunities are a moving target. And I recommend that we do not try to imitate past success stories, because tomorrow's successes actually depend on anticipating the future today. And successes of today are because the people who did them anticipated the future some time ago, sometimes a long time ago. So you can't just start late and think you're going to do the same thing and achieve the same results. Leaps in development are based on aiming at a technological opportunity space and having the conditions to take advantage of it. So it isn't just that it's there, it's also that you can. So this much matters. Opportunities actually change with each technological revolution and along their diffusion trajectories. Western Europe, for instance, moved to mass consumption with the mass production revolution, and from the First World War, actually. It began in the US in 1908 with Ford's Model T. But with that mass production revolution, they were able to follow the US, and they continued until the 70s, actually technologically catching up, while the US was already beginning to decline technologically and starting with the ICT revolution. Latin America and Asia grew with import substitution industrialization when those technologies matured. But Africa couldn't grow very much with it because they came late. So it isn't just to take advantage of the opportunity, you have to take advantage of the opportunity when it comes. Okay, so Africa came late. Then Japan and the Four Tigers took the double technological opportunity of the paradigm shift to ICT. Some of you might have read my CEPAL paper about technological opportunities as a moving target. There I explain what this double opportunity is, maturity of the old and the new paradigm coming. And China and the BRICS have taken advantage of the globalization train with foreign investment and their own learning on top of that. Now, taking advantage of each opportunity depends on previous capabilities, technological and social, for whatever reason, political and entrepreneurial will, and good timing, as I have mentioned before. So let's look at the import substitution industrialization opportunity for jobs and growth, not for a leap in development, that was taken by Latin America from the late 50s to the late 70s. They took advantage of a very important sort of conjunction of interests. The mature industries in the advanced world were desperately looking for market growth, and also at first for market growth and later for lower costs. So that was what they were aiming for. And at the same time, the third world, what was called the third world then, developing countries now only, governments looking for paths to develop. So having that common interest, what they did was to import parts instead of finished products. So they weren't really doing the whole manufacturing, they were just doing assembly. Set up tariff barriers and accepted low productivity and high prices to increase employment. And when I say low productivity, I really mean plants working at 20, 25, 30%, except in the very big countries like Brazil. Practically all plants worked at a ridiculously low capability utilization, and of course that meant high prices with high protection, and that was accepted because it created many, many jobs and brought many people into production, into manufacturing, and so on. Now the declared focus was the final stage of the fabricating, the assembly industries, for the domestic market only. In fact, most contracts for import substitution had a clause that said you can neither export anywhere nor make any innovations. That's how limited it was when you were doing import substitution in Latin America. So it was the mature products of Fordism, and in practice this led to growth with little technological learning and rare innovation in those industries. However, the real learning occurred elsewhere, in the complementary activities. And this is what made a difference. So it was construction of roads, ports, structures, buildings, housing, because you have to move all these parts and all these products. Transport, commerce, distribution, and banking. Management of large and small firms, infrastructure, water, electricity, telephone, transport, etc. Processing industries, these very important for the future. The processing industries, food, beer, cement, paper, bottles, metallurgy, etc. So that's what really happened, and that's why growth gives now a platform for doing other things. It wasn't just because there were a few plants. And previous learning continued, of course, in some cases intensified in raw materials production, mining, oil, agriculture, livestock, etc., depending on what each country's specialization was. So import substitution acted as the starter engine of economy-wide limited learning, but there was a lot of learning. So while it was adequate for the context, it achieved growth. It didn't achieve development in the big sense that, like Korea today. But it achieved growth, and it achieved a lot of learning, and it created a middle class, an educated middle class capable of doing the management and some science and engineering and so on. So when world conditions changed and protection was lifted, the whole model collapsed. And that's when we have the lost decade. But there are things left. Now let's look at the Asian leap. That began with ISI also, import substitution, but because they didn't have raw materials to fund it, they didn't have this income from raw materials, they had to export. So they began, from the beginning they were exporting, and soon they took advantage of the window of opportunity that opened from the 1970s with ICT. So what they did was to specialize in mass fabrication. They specialized in assembly for export markets. They even began with just the bottom, but they went up very quickly. They made alliances to produce electronics, electrical, electromechanical goods, and textile clothing, which was the first one, and shipbuilding also. Very important. They took advantage of low-cost labor and made huge efforts in training and education. It is one of the most significant features of the leap that they made, is that they actually gave enormous importance to education. And when the ICT revolution came, they were ready to make the leap, and now they're innovating their way up. How could we identify an opportunity space for Latin America today that's perhaps complementary with growth in Asia, which is the place where most dynamism is occurring, and therefore it makes a lot of sense to look at that? Well, first of all, what are the conditions in Asia? Abundance of extremely low-cost labor, high specialization in assembled products, growth by incorporation of new consumers and new territories, insufficient natural resources, so this is materials for all this production, food for all these people, high and growing import demand. How about Latin America? Specificity and advantages. Abundance and variety of natural resources, much lower population density, with very few exceptions in little regions, very, very low population density compared to Asia. Traditional capabilities in natural resources and their processing, as we just said, because that's what they learned during import substitution and from before, actually. A prospective increase in demand and rising prices of energy and materials, raw and processed. This is very controversial. I have held this. I cannot discuss it now because, we can't cover, I'm going to cover a lot anyway. But this is one of the premises of this thing, that in fact, the reason why raw materials were cheap in mass production is because labor was expensive in the north, and it was very important to have cheap raw materials. Now, the global corporations are actually interested in expensive raw materials because now everything they're finding is more expensive, and because they have to do a lot of R&D, etc. We will talk about that just a little bit, and you will find some of those things in the hidden slides. The companies that are producing and using raw materials are currently engaging in a strategic reorientation, which has to do a bit with what I told you and a few other things. But mainly, competition between East and West can strengthen the negotiating position of the raw materials producers, because China and the West both want it. So if the country knows exactly what it wants to do, what it wants to process, what it would like to learn, etc., negotiating is now easier than when it was just between companies in the same world who could actually get together. So could then natural resources be a platform for development? This is what I see as a route for a South American lead, taking advantage of the opportunity of the 2010s. To specialize in the processing industries around natural resources for export markets. To make alliances to produce energy and materials, basic and special, natural and synthetic, macro and nano, and biological products, traditional and advanced, ecological and biotechnological, adding technology and innovating up and downstream. And when the next revolution comes, which is possibly biotech, nanotech, new materials and green materials, the economies can be ready to make the leap. Would that be possible? Well, the ideas about the role of natural resources in development have changed over time, have changed significantly. At the end of the 19th century and early 20th, they were seen as a huge advantage. It was a major asset to favor and finance development. So the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, and the Scandinavian countries all actually developed on the basis of their strong position in natural resources. Now, after World War II, they were seen as a disadvantage. In the 1940s and 50s, increasing advantage goes to manufacturing industry, the price scissors situation, Prebisch, Singer, etc., 45, 51, 49 in that time. So there was a first effort to fight against the price scissors quite early on. In the 1970s, we have the economists talking about the Dutch disease, when Holland started having problems with gas and the price, and having manufacturing lose out because of their of the Dutch disease, their exchange rate. And in the 1980s and 90s, of course, we have the most important attack on the possibility of using natural resources. That's the resource curse notion. Sachs and Wagner in 95, Auti in 95 also. And apart from the fact that I think their data are very, very dodgy because they took just the period when everything was wrong for countries like Trinidad and Tobago, and for Saudi Arabia they have a huge leap after they cut off. But anyway, that's not the most important, because it is true that corruption comes together with natural resources. So it doesn't have to be that you don't grow, it just has to be that you get corruption with it, depending on the government and so on. So, but anyway, that's a big, big, big a big question mark on what I'm going to say, and I admit it's a big question mark, but it depends how it's done and what happens. So that is one of the biggest problems, but I still think that they could be an advantage now. Now let's see what are the new conditions for innovation. And then the natural resources as a platform for growth and networks of innovation, grassroots wealth creation as a direct solution to overcome poverty, and a new paradigm for strategy and governance. As you can see, it's going to be long. Where are we? 20 minutes. Okay. No, it's impossible that I do it in 20 minutes. What's left is going to take about 35 minutes. So, I'm sorry. I'll try to go as fast as I can without losing the thread. Okay, which are the context conditions that enable a greater technological autonomy in developing countries? First of all, the hyper-segmentation of global markets, the whole idea of the long tail, the niche markets, the thing, the mass, the adaptability, etc. The hyper-segmentation of global corporations, which means that they'll have little bits in different countries and you can specialize even in high-tech things. And the fact that they have more responsible behavior due to transparency, because everybody can find out through the internet, and because they need creative personnel and they cannot make their personnel unhappy and forced, because people, in order to get them to be creative, they have to be happy at home, in their country, in their things, so they cannot behave as monstrously as before, because everybody will find out and that will create a problem. So somehow there are reasons why they're behaving in this such nice corporate social responsibility way, and giving better conditions to workers and so on. The advanced companies, not the not so advanced ones. So the coexistence of a diversity of technologies and a diversity of scales of production, transport, and distribution. This is one of the most important things, to have the possibility of producing small quantities. You don't have to produce 100 containers a month. You can actually produce a container every 2 or 3 months, and they can be sold in little stores, and that way some village can live off a particular little product, a herb or something with a nice box design or whatever. I mean, there are things happening all over the world of this sort, and of course people can do apps and sell on the internet some special chocolate or whatever. So the open access provided by internet to global information, world trade and expert networks also helps. So we actually have a set of conditions that were nowhere near existing 40, 50 years ago when most of the development theories developed. So actually we are having to look at every single thing we believed before and look at what has happened to change it. So we have to mistrust anything that was written before 1990 actually. Just take a look at it again. Okay, in a way, all these things are all related to hypersegmentation. So I'm going to look at that in particular as one of the consequences. So let's look at market hypersegmentation and the different conditions for competition and profitability. The world used to basically be stretched out. Commodity products, a lot of them. Custom products, very few, just capital goods and bridesmaids dresses or something. And I mean, in the world of mass production, custom made was very rare, except in some capital goods. In the middle was the great majority, fashion things, products, etc. So what you had at that extreme was price competition, advantages in cost and in process technologies, and at this extreme, competition in adaptability, advantages in access to clients, quality, flexibility, and rapid response. But now we have this enormous breakup, like a kaleidoscopic breakup of the whole market for each product. And we now have the bottom line is practically based on profitability through volume, And markets are protected through low cost and reliable basic qualities and deliveries. So if you're going at that bottom end, you're going to have to compete in low cost. Of course, not if you come to this, to the right-hand side, where you can actually, I mean, if you have a good plumber and he charges 3 times more than 3 bad plumbers that you had before, you will actually pay the good plumber. So, and that happens right through when you have adaptability. But then when you go up in all products, you have high profitability that is no longer due just to low cost, but to special qualities. And markets are then protected by differentiation, innovation, technology, brands, and patents. Whether that specialization or differentiation is about fashion and super whatever, or if it's really because you've adapted to some need, that's a serious need, it doesn't matter. The thing is that those markets have different conditions from the pure volume commodity low-cost things. And the important thing is that this applies from raw materials to all manufacturing and services. Every single market is now hyper-segmented. Take a look. Anybody, I'm sure most of you, many of you are studying actual industries, and you know that it's very difficult now to talk about one industry. Sometimes the niche markets of 5 industries have more in common than all the producers within the same industry. And they also apply to each activity along the value network. So we're also talking, because of the outsourcing and all this decomponentization of all big global corporations, then you also have little markets and big markets, so you have specialized producers and you have mass production, volume production of parts or of services. Let me give you some examples of positioning so you actually get a better sense of what this means. So for the standardized markets, we have the basic ones. The typical raw materials, wheat, meat, but also auto parts, standard auto parts, computer disk drives, standard software, standard mobile phones. Now even with a smartphone, they are even perhaps in threat of disappearance unless they do something. Call centers, beach tourism. So as you can see, from raw materials, through manufacturing, through services of different sorts, you can have low-cost, high-volume products. Then we go to the special ones. We have organic food, which commands a premium price, boutique steel, intelligent materials, Starbucks coffee, just because of the brand and the atmosphere and all that, they can charge 3 times as much. Gourmet fruits, if we could have the delicious fruits that you actually still get in the countryside, but you don't buy when they are packed and perfect, but taste of nothing. That's a gigantic market that I am sure is going to develop. Parmigiano Reggiano, of course, because it's that special thing. Scratch-free nanotechnology paint. Electric automobiles. iPhones, they're no longer, they're going down. Shh. That's another thing. You're up there and you have to stay up there by innovation. Things fall down to being more basic gradually if the markets really grow. Diagnostic kits, adventure tourism. So again, we have services or things that are very, very sort of high-tech or very special. Then we come to customized things. Dell computers, blue jeans to size, Zara clothing, Kenya-ready salads. You know that Kenya packs every day and sends by plane whatever the British supermarkets ask for. So every morning there are a whole set of vans, trucks taking everything to all supermarkets. At 2 o'clock again they get the orders and then they pack the whole thing and send them every single day. E-government software, personal services, technical support. Of course, technical support, it depends on your problem. Programmable hearing aids, health tourism, for instance, hip operations in India, where people go and stay in the hotel, then in the hospital, then and then they rehab, and then they come back, and it's like tourism at the same time, and it's a very good industry for India. And then we have the unique things, which are both adaptable and special, and that is the design of landmark buildings like the Beijing Stadium, major information systems, airport design and construction, R&D in special areas, instruments for nanotech, tourism in Chichen Itza or in the Amazon, I mean, unique things, or in the Vatican, you know, whatever. So higher profitability and less vulnerability result from repositioning through innovation that strengthens the existing expertise and advantages in whatever sector. Even though Nokia was able to come out of a boots production or whatever, don't take that as the example of what happens in the world. In the world, people know a little bit about something or a lot about something. It's much easier for them to bring in innovation onto something that you really know. So moving up, you become safer and better. So can natural resource producers take advantage of these new circumstances? Well, let's identify the conditions that make it possible. So let's see them as a platform. First of all, a successful strategy must encompass the whole natural resource-based network, from capital goods and services to processing and delivery. So if we take natural resource production, we go up to investment, including exploration or whatever, if it's in mining or oil or whatever. And then you have the various stages of processing, different types of processing, packaging, branding, transport, marketing, distribution. Think, for instance, of this, I mentioned gourmet fruit. Yeah, why do you think they're not exported? Because they don't last. Because there's no way of packaging them without becoming blemished. Because they are not like the perfect tomato that General Electric developed in hydroponic, whatever, so that they really, in order to keep taste, it would have been much more difficult. What they wanted was for it to last a long time and for it to look good in the supermarket shelf. And those were the criteria for innovation, not taste. So if we want to keep taste, it's our job in the developing countries, the ones that still have fruit that taste something, because I don't think there are any left in the advanced world. So, on the other hand, we have equipment, inputs, RD&E, and services, which interrelate to each other and to every one of these things. So this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about one little raw material something. We're talking about a massive effort, which can be done. I mean, there are capabilities in different stages, in different countries, with different possibilities on different agricultural or mineral or energy things. But there is this possibility if it is organized that way. So we need dynamism for growth and development, which results from the interactions among the members of the network in a system of innovation. The natural resource industries and their innovation networks. Now, do you think that with what I've said, you had a good sense of what I'm talking about? Just in case, I'm going to give you a list. Mining, metallurgy, chemicals, petrochemicals, pharmaceuticals, custom materials, livestock, agriculture, hydroponics, agro-industries, biotechnology, fisheries, aquaculture, forestry, paper, ceramics, glass, packaging, energy, refining, electricity, nanotechnology, etc., each including commodities and specialities. And multiple engineering services, software and system services, capital goods, equipment and instruments, laboratory services, conservation and packaging, transport, marketing and distribution, technical service to users, market intelligence, R&D improvements and new products, patent lawyers, contract negotiation, training and education of specialized personnel, etc., etc. Now, do you think that's enough? Success depends on continuous improvement of technologies, companies, products, human capital, and networks. But there is a very, very wide space for getting the game right. Now we're going to look at the forces driving innovation in the natural resource network, what we just talked about. We have, first of all, market volume. Because why is market volume growing? Well, because the advanced world continues to need food and materials and all this thing, but because the whole of the emerging world and gradually the whole of the developing world is requiring also food and materials and all the rest. So there is, demand is growing. So we have market volume growing. So what are the challenges to overcome by innovation in this area? Now this, by the way, is what has always been the nature of natural resources. You have diminishing quality of deposits, lands, etc. So you always have the problem of the better lands getting a better price and the ones that have worse lands having to sometimes even make a loss because, you have this problem. So you have to innovate in order to be able to use those less good lands or deposits or whatever. Greater difficulty of access. Well, imagine the subsoil oil in Brazil. I mean, that's really serious stuff to get several miles down, and that's even worse than most of the ones that are offshore now. So we're talking about things like that, limited and immobile supply of different qualities, economies of scale in processing, so that is another problem that has to be done by innovating. Maybe we have to invent mobile ways of processing rather than having these huge plants. But that requires a lot of science and innovation to see if it's possible to do that, so that you can have smaller things and you can move them around. The reason why processing is generally near the users is because you can bring from any mine or any land or whatever, agriculture or whatever, you take it to the country where it's going to be used, and you process it all together, and you have more flexibility. And of course, the reason why, that's the same reason why in most countries you have food processing, because it's to be consumed right there, and it's also using generally the agricultural thing, so it doesn't make much sense. Or it does in some cases if you actually want Heinz or whatever, the different brands. But okay, market requirements, segmentation and differentiation. That's what the market is asking for, and it's getting used to it, and it expects that you will provide it. Importance of qualities, which means custom materials, which is very similar to the segmentation stuff. The fact that public opinion is now moving towards fair trade and the environment. So there are two things that matter to public opinion in the advanced world, and I hope gradually will matter to the Chinese. In fact, because they have such pollution problems which are so horrendous, they are beginning to really understand that, it wasn't so easy after all. Pro-recycling and renewables and versus pollution, which is part of the environmental thing. So those are requirements of the market for the qualities of the products. Then we have ICT and other science and technology advances. You have ease of distance coordination, ease of handling variety at all levels, a drastic reduction in time and in cost of innovation and adaptation. You can even do innovation in chemistry and on the computer first. You don't have to you don't have to go and test it first. You first do a lot in the computer, and you test it when it's almost ready to prove what you found. Then you have biotech, nanotech applications to natural resource activities, which are increasingly what the orientation in Latin America is, which I think is very good, because fighting with the US on diagnostic kits only and things like that is not such a good idea. Green chemistry, which is of course growing, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in science and technology, but there are a whole lot of them that affect and influence favorably innovation in materials. Then in terms of market context, we have first of all the globalization of production, so it's possible to have a part of processes and all that. They're expected to be spread all over the world, so that makes a difference. Outsourcing, offshoring, and corporate social responsibility, which you already mentioned. Competition between China and the West for scarce resources, already mentioned. Prospective change in relative costs. This is very important. If energy, materials, transport, and labor change, favoring processing in situ, what's happening now? Salaries are rising in China because they want domestic market to be important, and therefore they're going to do precisely what the advanced world did. Make your own workers into consumers. So that's one thing that's happening. But on the other hand, because of the things we have just discussed, energy and materials, and therefore transport, which uses energy, might be going up. So we have the world coming in our direction. I mean, I realize there are some Chinese and other people here. I mean, in the direction of the people I'm talking about, which is Latin America and possibly Africa, and probably Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Russia, and so on. I mean, those are possibly the big competitors. Okay. Oh, sorry. I didn't say what I wanted to say about that, which is that the likelihood of processing in situ, processing there, is going to be it's going to make more sense. I mean, why take a huge amount of earth, of rock, together with the metals if you can just process first and then you don't have to pay a lot of money for nothing, and then you have to get rid of it on the other side. So there are going to be many things that might actually change the conditions for processing from what they used to be to what they might be if those prices change. Okay, so imagine that we were to do this, and we're looking at the possibility of having networks of local high-tech services that would help the technological upgrading of the natural resource export profile. So all the countries that are now exporting raw materials could actually set up a process to improve their export profile with special materials, with specialized this or that. And we would have then the natural resource production and processing industries, be they foreign or local, with or without R&D, etc., and their current export markets. Then one can think of setting up a local network of firms and institutions that are doing research, high-tech production, and knowledge-intensive services, and work with those companies. Of course, you have to get consensus, and that's not always so easy, but supposing they were to realize that this could bring advantages, then you can have these networks with foreign networks also in interconnection, as they always have, and that could provide new additional specialized markets, some of which would be actually attached to the original companies, and they would learn that they can get something out of it, and therefore they would be willing to fund the research, and some would actually be exported directly by the high-tech services or whatever firms. So you have this possibility, which also could be funded, the transformation could be funded with the high price of materials, or with those taxes that countries are learning to put on raw materials for foreign companies that are exporting raw materials and so on. So this is one of the means by which we could get these networks going and the result of improving the export profile. But of course we have to take the limits into account. The processing industries require increasingly qualified personnel. The actual processing industry, perhaps not agriculture itself, or not necessarily. But the thing is that a strategy based on them promises rising incomes and better quality of life only for the participants. But they're not labor intensive. So they're not like, assembly manufacturing. That's a lot of jobs. Just one plant and you get immediately 400 jobs. It's quick. Whereas this is not necessarily so, and it requires higher skills, and people have to work in teams, and it's quite different. The processing industries are not the same. And the problem is that Latin America has a very serious income distribution and employment problem. So how can growth be achieved with social equity under these circumstances? So let's look at grassroots wealth creation as a direct solution to overcome poverty. So we have two different and complementary goals. On the one hand, economic growth and global positioning. That's the high-tech stuff going to export. And then full employment and well-being for all, including the villages and the city slums, the whole lot. So those are two different yet integrated parts of the economy. That's how it would have to be. Otherwise, we're going to have an increasing inequality rather than decreasing. So a strategy like this has to be dual. So let's look at how the dual integrated model would work with top-down and grassroots up, with converging processes of growth and innovation. First of all, you have what we could call the engines of growth. There would be constantly upgraded production networks around natural resources. Those are the top guys. And their role would be to have competitive technologies for global markets. So this is actually the sort of free market sort of idea of what you do if you really are good. Although I don't think we should be stopped from protecting whatever we want to protect, and we'll have to find ways around the WTO or whatever. But basically, the idea is that you can have proper innovation and there are already examples. I don't know whether I should give you the examples because I'm worried, but if you want, at the end, we discuss that. And then we would have interconnected, specialized local economies in clusters and individual bits and so on, where we would get differentiated development of each part of the territory, bit by bit, based on the local productive vocation identified or promoted for domestic or foreign markets. So you've got to do a lot of work. I'll tell you what, for import substitution, in Chile, they had an institute connected with CEPAL, I think it was Intal that did it, that trained thousands, literally thousands of Latin American government and civil servants to learn how to do import substitution, which required so much complication, calculations, things, forms, it was a huge thing. It was very bureaucratic. It worked for what it was. It did achieve its purposes. Well, thousands of people were trained. There's nothing stopping us from training more than that, if this is going to be a real possibility. And there are many people who would be willing to do that. So what do we have at the top? The objective would be growth and generation of foreign exchange. And of course, generation of profit for the guys who do it. On the other hand, to raise the quality of life of all inhabitants. That would be to make sure that you do the other part. And an active state that facilitates and promotes local initiative, provides infrastructure, funds, enabling institutions and human capital, and all these things are interconnected. In some cases, those local economies could be producing for the actual top firms. In some cases, they are exporting. In some cases, they are regional. They have regional markets or markets in the cities or whatever. There's ample space for innumerable and profitable small companies in both high-tech and low-tech segments. Let's look at the simple and the complex in terms of natural resources. Okay, we have a niche. You can have, of course, the traditional artisan ceramics, but now you can actually find good outlets for them, not just for the tourists to come to you, but you can send them out. You can have village life tourism. Lots of people from the very advanced world would love to live in an Andean village with, with all the houses, with the milk being from the goat and the whole sort of real thing. And that is being done, by the way. There are many already, dozens of Andean villages that are actual hotels. The whole village becomes like a hotel. Some do the cleaning, some do the food, some do the sleeping, some do the agriculture and so on, and tourism. So that's one end. The other end, a biotechnological diagnostic kit, of course, high-tech. Work at a distance. You can have call centers, which are just basic, although in India I understand it's university graduates that do it, but that's life. Interpretation of geological data. Actually, I shouldn't have it there because I don't know. Maybe that's a bad example for that, because it's true that you've got to have the perfect language on all these things, so it might be. I will change that. Interpretation of geological data can be done at a distance and is being done. Geological and medical data and all these things, it's now, and sometimes, for instance, US doctors will send very complicated tomographies and things like that to India, while India is awake and they are sleeping. So when they wake up in the morning, they already have the results. So things like that are very, they can be done depending on what continent you're working for. Local outsourcing, a diet food service, for instance, for the office buildings, for the whatever, you can learn how to do it, or for children. Or at the other extreme, a data security service, which is very complex. For localization, you can have an exquisite local cheese, or you can have gourmet fruit or herbs, and those can be exported or developed locally. And a fault detection service, for instance, for oil pipes or for whatever. Environmental protection, you can have organic vegetables, or you can have bacteria to digest oil spills, which are high biotech technology. So taking advantage of all of these is going to require imagination, information, knowledge, and competent support institutions at both ends of the dual strategy. And finally, a new paradigm for governance. a dual development strategy, in my view. I have been a public servant, so I know the types of difficulties that a group having to deal with things that are very different, with groups that are very different, can have. So I think this would need two distinct sets of policies. The top-down policy framework actually has to behave as a complement, and it has to work in support of the advanced companies, but very differently from the grassroots up framework, which behaves as developmental support. So it's more protective, it's more keeping, taking you by the hand until you finally can walk. It's a very, very different type of behavior of the public servant. So in the top-down, the civil servants that work in the policy, give policy and political support in achieving synergies, in negotiating with foreign partners, in doing RD&E, and in other needs as defined by knowledgeable companies. They tell you what they really need because they know what they're doing. And one of the most horrendous things is when public servants who don't really know anything about the company they're talking to try to sort of force them in this way or that way, or they say, it's horrible. It's horrible because then what you create is a confrontation between the companies that sort of look down on the civil servants, and then the civil servants saying they just don't want to pay attention. And it is, I have seen it happen, I'm sorry, but that's what it is. So there has to be knowledge and mutual respect and so on. I think the example of Singapore is one of those very good examples of how knowledgeable civil servants and knowledgeable business people can work together and be very successful. They actually used to move over. But then in this one, it's completely different. There you really have to promote and help identify opportunities and market niches. You have to have a different type of knowledge, a knowledge that the people you're helping usually don't have. You give technical and financial support in setting up the business and in the required innovations. You provide training, offer other needed help to what are in fact infant companies, and very often need even to learn how to be entrepreneurial. They need how to go to the market, how to get a loan, all sorts of very simple things. And of course, since we have always been thinking that what we need is to get somebody to set up a company that will give employment to these guys, then what we're doing is facilitating profits, so that you get more and more employment. But how about doing it the other way? How about getting the wealth creation to come from the bottom and the people who want the employment to actually create their employment collectively? And this is also, by the way, happening a lot. It's happening in various countries. And again, the problem of examples will come up. So requiring separate institutions and different personnel. The personnel for helping the grassroots up has to be vocational personnel. People who want to do this, who care about what they're doing, and who are willing to study a lot and to move and to find and to fight with the bank and to talk to international things and, are really like fathering this thing. Whereas the others have to be just very respectful and work. They're very different in terms of and they also, the type of knowledge they have to have is different and so on. Now, the promise of this particular strategy, when taking paradigm shifts into account, in this particular moment, is that we could have a leap in development in two stages. It could be that this is like the preparation stage, and maybe sort of like Korea with ISI first, and then leaping with the next technological revolution. We could achieve growth now, taking advantage of the current window of opportunity for natural resource producers, and at the same time prepare to make the leap in development with the next technological revolution by developing capabilities, companies, and global networks in the sectors of the future: biotechnology, nanotechnology, bioelectronics, new materials, which can all be used to achieve growth now, but you're getting all these specialized companies, and when this revolution comes, you can just leap. And that is what Asia did without planning it with the ICT revolution. We can plan it. But it requires intense efforts in training, education, research, development, and engineering, and innovative cooperation at all levels and in all stages. So we're really asking for a deep conviction in the country, like a big push yes we can, sort of thing. And I don't know. I'm afraid that's so difficult. That is, I think, probably the biggest hurdle, is how do you get the country to believe that it can be done? How do you start? What's the mechanism? What are the feedback loops? Can this strategy be applied by other natural resource producers? Yes. The most likely is that there will be competition among the producers as well as among the companies and countries that require the resources. Of course, there are different products, 5 countries for one product, 7 countries for the other, 3 for another, and maybe 25 for another. It all depends what the products are and what the demand is. So advantages will probably go to those who have already acquired basic technological and social capabilities for producing, negotiating, networking and innovating, to those possessing the resources with more dynamic demand and higher prices. I mean, those resources that have more dynamic demand. You know, it's, of course, somebody, I don't know what's going to happen to oil, but obviously the people who have had oil have had a lot of money coming to them just because instead of having tin, they had oil. And to the first movers, because there are first mover advantages, even with the international companies. Once somebody already has everything set up, another international company will come and also want to go next door and to the next one. This is a typical phenomenon that has occurred a lot. So if you're using international companies for this, then the first movers, of course. And then also, the sooner you go, because you're a first mover, you also have the suppliers, the technical services, all these things that others don't have, and therefore you negotiate better and so on. But however it is, the understanding of the opportunity needs to be shared by all in each country, because success may depend on reaching an agreed direction for guiding markets and ensuring the future. So a consensus vision, private sector, public sector, and society, I think, would be necessary for applying this sort of policy, and I do think it's difficult, but I don't think without it, it could be done. Thank you. You can find papers.